Volunteer lesson today is Juan. JM Teach one in the chat. Just got off the phone with him. We're dealing with a guy who's feeling like his game is a little bit more passive. Knows that it's more passive than it should be. He's recently done some reg review on the best regs at his limit and kind of used that to compare where his stats are off. I think that's a good way to sort of scale into mass database analysis. Is like before you have PO solver subset scripts that are showing you like what suggested frequencies are in certain lines, the next best thing is to look at what the winningest guys are doing. But the strange thing about that is that in a lot of ways it might give you exploitative. It might reveal to you where they're being exploitative, and you might interpret that as being well balanced, which isn't necessarily like a bad thing. But if you're studying the best regs of the limit, believing that they're going to be the types of players who are closest to the equilibrium, that might not actually be true, considering that the pools are very imbalanced, and that I think the winningest players are the ones that are the most accurately exploitative. So yeah, we've got another graph that's drooping red line at around negative 2, a little bit more than, actually, yeah, about negative 2 buy-ins per 1,000 hands. So definitely in the red zone of the red line graph in terms of being able to for sure bring the red line up while improving win rate. We're playing on party. I'm going to be looking at hands from 400 NL. What up, D-Dog? I wanted to go into a question that I missed from Johnny C last time. I said I would lead with it. By the way, I'm still in my gym outfit because worked out, went straight into meetings, still on that hustle. No time for showers. Johnny asked about 3-bet pots when defending from the button versus the blinds. He wanted to know more or less what he should be focused on because he noticed that he wasn't defending enough versus c-bet. When he's on the button, he calls the big blind 3-bet, and then he faces c-bet on the flop. So he was sort of asking, like, what's the best approach to that to try to integrate better strategies, and I hesitate to say more well-balanced strategies, but in an environment, in a universal trend where people are not 3-betting enough, we have to start to consider that we should be playing more solid ranges versus 3-bets. So if you remember, Run It Once guys, if you saw that video I did, which was called PO Solver Explorations, it was sort of a mock model of what 3-bet frequencies were on like Bovada Small Stakes NL, which I think are actually pretty close to what a lot of small stakes environments use, something like a 10 to 12% 3-bet from the blinds. Brian, one of my guys, actually has the clairvoyant range for what the Bovada guys use, and it's more linear than you would think. So basically, if you look at what a 10% range looks like, it's very hard to combat that post flop, even with what we know about hotspots. Really, the only hotspot in that line that I see as showing up over the aggregation of the subset reports are that they check fold flop too much. Every other line they defend quite well, because once you're pushing a certain amount of equity pre-flop, which it's very easy to do when you're 3-betting a range of like 10%, it becomes hard to misplay that post-flop because you just have so many hands that have good qualities of equity, and fish are able to defend a little bit more easily. So what I would say is your real modeling starts pre-flop. That's the most relevant spot. You want to make sure that you're not calling a range of like wider than 15% or so. If you're in a pool where people are nit 3-betting, which I'm saying is most pools, from there I would study the optimal solutions, and I would pick, like, if you even just want to use a subset report of different flops, so maybe you have like 30 flops that you designate for this month that you're going to study systematically in terms of how to get closest to the flop defense. And the way that I would drill that, it might be something I include in the night vision pack. I'm trying to think of better training exercises, but one that's worked for my guys in the past is sort of a flashcard exercise. Remember that game where it's like memory, and you have the cards face down, you flip it over and you see Goofy or whatever cartoon character it is, you put it back down and you try to match it as you go. With this, it's like you're using PO Solver to flash the solution on the strategy grid to you, you want to look at what the worst hands in your range are that the solver is defending in your position on a given flop, and then after you cycle through a few of those, you go back without the strategy grid, so you don't have it in front of you anymore, and you try to mimic what the worst types of hands in your range you would defend on a certain board are. The goal being to eventually not need the strategy grid in front of you to know what the bottom of your range is. Now, moving to the turn, he was asking what's more relevant. Should I study flop, or should I try to figure out like what turns I should overfold? I think that was part of his question at least. I think as a general rule of thumb, until your context sort of gets more advanced, you should just try to play as close to what the solver recommends as possible. Because if I start telling you that, like, oh, there's certain textures you can overfold, I think that you're going to over apply that in the same way that a lot of guys have been over applying the things that I've been just eliminating from their game in the previous streams. That's why I'm making them like fold rivers pretty much religiously when they're unsure of themselves, because they see the biggest leak is that guys spew money on call offs. So with this type of stuff, it's like, yeah, I could tell you which turns are more imbalanced that they barrel, but it's not really going to help you if your context isn't subtle enough to be able to recognize the patterns or the concepts that are creating that. And that's more advanced stuff that I think happens on a minority of textures. So in the spirit of simplifying and streamlining the growth process, I would say that the most efficient way to scale it is to study what PO Solver does, get a feel for that equilibrium, and then once you're doing that efficiently and you already have good win rate, and you're confident that your system is sound in that regard, then we scale into more exploitative territory where it's like, okay, now here are the spots where they're really not barreling turn enough. Here's why, and here's how we can show it based on manual strategy grids. Cool. Just came out of a night vision meeting. Pretty pumped. Thing is getting more and more refined than I thought it could be. Team is kicking ass, so props to my guys. I'm going to go right into these 2-4 hand histories. I'm going to do it slightly different today. I have 50 BB to 20 BB pots marked, and I'm doing one and lost. So we'll be seeing sort of both ends of it. Juan had said that he's a little bit worried he might be missing value in certain spots, and from my perspective, I wanted to switch it up a little bit so that we're not always looking at, lost pots where we're facing aggression or something like that. So we're on Party Poker, MSNL. What up, server? ISO. Fish folds. I know that name from somewhere. So the small blind limp calls and now donks. Donking again for half pot. On a board like this, where that turn card is actually going to improve his equity distribution if he was donking merged or with like suited connector type hands, I think that we have a high confidence at this point that, like, with his sizing too being scaled down toward half pot, that like he's most likely merged or equity driven here, and without like a super high confidence in what his river bet frequency would be, I think I would just raise now. My reasoning being that I don't think he's got a ton of very low equity bluffs, and so I sort of value sticking the raise in right now, getting the value that I can off of his pair plus draws and 10x, potentially being able to get another street of value on really good runoffs, maybe like 30% of runoffs you can stick in another bet. So I would raise now. Now once he fires river, I think we just have to call. I mean, it does suck that his main top pair holding got there. We could fold if we thought that he was a... Okay, so depending on the player profile, it really hinges whether or not we should fold or call here. If it's a type of guy who we think is reg status, won't value bet own himself, like he's not the type of guy who'll show up with like 9-8 or pocket sevens, especially for a polarized sizing, then we can find the fold, because at that point this card is actually very bad for us, even though it diminishes, even though it's hard for him to have a set at this point of tens. three of a kind because of the fact that now there's removal on the 10. He actually still just gained a lot of potential value that beats us. So versus a reg who I knew wasn't value owning himself and who I thought was going to struggle to use high enough river aggression with his equity pushing draws from the turn, I think we can actually find a fold here. So my final answer would be, depending on player profile, I'm folding versus the reg and calling versus anybody who has any indications of being a fish, unless it's a super passive fish who's playing something like 55. But even those guys have tendencies to like value own themselves slightly in lines like this. The donk line is very, very fish oriented. So I find it really hard to justify being able to fold rivers versus a fish when they're playing a donk 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 line, because they could either be bluffing at some sort of non-zero frequency for sure, because the line is that imbalanced to begin with, or they could be potentially merging some sort of dominated value hand. So I said I know this name from somewhere, which makes me think he's a reg. So I think I would actually fold this river. But that's just my wild guess that this isn't a guy who's a fish. I might be completely wrong. What did Juan, tell us what your reads are on this player while I read the chat. Hey Banksta asked, have you thought about adding a forum on Poker Detox? It was something that I did consider. Um, and I think the reason that I've sort of not done it yet is because I don't feel like I have a big enough community yet that something like that would be like as awesome as I would want it to be before I put it out. I do think that with the leverage that we're going to create from the night vision pack, that we might start to make some noise in the industry, to the level that maybe it would make sense to have like a new collective of poker minds that thought about the game in this way, and we're sort of through with trying to sort of flip everyone else in the community who still wants to approach things from an over theory oriented approach. I see that as something that could be healthy, like a healthy outlet for guys who have really clarified that this is the direction that they want to go in, and that they don't want to tolerate the noise from skeptics in the theory oriented side of things that are just like constantly assessing but never actually producing any sort of real results. So I think it could be something that we move into in the new year. Looks like Brian sort of said the gist of it. Yeah, I didn't want it to become like other forums too, in the sense of where I had to like monitor the healthiness of it. Um, then again, like from everything I've seen so far from the Twitch channel, especially, like we seem to attract a pretty healthy crowd. I think I've made it clear that like I'm not really here for entertainment purposes. So there's not many lazy guys that show up, and the guys that do show up have enough healthy ambition that I think it stays really clean in terms of like um, just being optimistic and not like unhealthily trolling. And what up, Kevin? What did Kevin say? Yeah, I think you just have to make it like you have to vet everyone well, and like I think the right way to do that is to offer it only to guys who have been with the packs the whole way, or guys who are actively getting private coaching who I know personally. One thing that I'm doing right now with this fitness program that I'm on is that I thought was cool, is that he has like a private group of 50 guys on Facebook that he made a group for, and those are all the guys that are doing like his 6 month program, and like most of us are like entrepreneurs and guys who already have our shit together, so there's sort of a there's like an entry barrier there. So yeah, it's like sort of my main concern would be making sure it's a healthy enough environment that it was sustainable without me having to monitor it. I watched Doug's top five last night of Vanessa Selbst, and I actually laughed out loud like more than once. I think he's actually getting like pretty entertaining with what he's doing, and I think that like one thing I would say about that, I don't mean to like when I say I'm not here for entertainment, it's because I'm clarified that I actually want to transform the SSNL to HSNL industry. Um, and I actually have total respect for anyone who becomes transparent about the fact that they're actually in it for entertainment. I think he's doing actually a really nice job of like bringing something unique with a perspective that just doesn't give a fuck, and will like do something like Call of an SSL style for just being a brat in like five different pots. At first, I didn't think it was all that entertaining, but I think that like the new episodes he's putting out are like really funny. Yeah, the range breakdown was funny. What's going on? Couldn't do that hand for some reason. Three bet, king queen versus button. I think we have a clear bet here. Um, yeah, you'll just fold ace highs, and I think you'll have decent fold equity on certain pocket pairs in his range. I think the sizing I would use would be something standard, like 2/3. I think this is totally fine. That's just not a hand in his range that you're planning on folding. This is like the stone bottom of my calling range here, I think, in this spot. Unless I know something about, like, if I was just functioning under vacuum knowledge, then I think I would like have a very close call here. This is something I think you guys might not understand totally about my system or my style. Is that like, you know me as aggro, I think, but there are spots where I'm very very nitty, and it comes down to how much equity I think a certain range will be pushing post flop against me. Like, I have no interest in defending any hand like weaker than this versus a 10% three bet. And I think that goes back to what I said about the Johnny C thing initially, that like your main thing should be to play intelligent defense versus three bet ranges so that you don't compound mistakes post flop by putting money in pre flop with hands that were negative EV to begin with. So yeah, I think this is like a cusp, sort of a cusp hand. Clear call on the flop, clear call on the turn, and clear check on the river. Looks good. I would always ISO more here, and I think it actually matters quite a bit, especially when you have a hand that's strong in your range. Um, so when I see this raise, what it registers to me as is like almost redundant. Like, not, it's not doing enough for repolarizing. Like, you have to understand, when you choose to repolarize, you should be trying to do it in a way where the amount of money that you put into the pot is as effective as possible for the type of range that you're playing. It's kind of a strange way to talk about it, but like, I just don't see why we need to waste time devising a range that plays well versus min raise when, like, the way I see it, fish plays so poorly post flop that there's no reason we shouldn't be able to just play one bet sizing as an ISO, like one strategic ISO raise sizing. I would make it something like pot, or maybe even slightly more than pot, and I would be raising like a really wide range of maybe like 9-8 off, any ace, any suited, like most suited at least, like linear suited, like 7-6 suited plus, any ace x suited, king 5 suited plus, stuff like that. I think just will play really well post flop versus a player who's naturally gonna peel too wide and then play shitty out of position post flop by either check folding too much, or not introducing himself into future streets with enough aggression after he does check call the flop. Are we like not getting the right positions here? I think it was Well, what it seemed like was, oh, a dead. I think it looked like a dead post, right? So this check raise is strong for the most part. He's got the fish behind him. It was four ways. It's an ace high monotone board. It's not one that I think generally gets fucked with all that often. I mean, we're definitely calling, but I'm a little bit weary. So this guy's like not even in the pot, but I guess he still has cards. Strange. Let's just pretend that guy's not there, I guess. I think we have a really clear fold here. Um, it's funny, I recorded a part two of the 30-second exercise for run on once last night, and there's kind of a hand really similar to this in there, where even like the best blocker is still a clear fold in this spot. And I wouldn't, oh, I guess he's all in. I was going to say I wouldn't jam it either because I just don't trust someone to fold, you know, ace jack plus often enough. So I think this is a over application of theory for sure. Unless this player is a total fish, but I think we would need a lot of information that someone was really, really capable of spewing. Because I'm guessing this pot is three-way. He's not in, so this guy was closing action. But the way this board ran off, like it's very hard for him to have an unpaired hand. So I would need to read that like the fish is turning something into a bluff, which is not generally what fish do in the first place. I think I would need a very high-profile fish read to fi this. Oh, he's Zhang. Alright, I have no idea what's going on here then, honestly. Why is it telling us that you're a different player than you are? And that guy showed up with Stone Air. So apparently he is the mega fish. I'm gonna skip that hand because it's confusing me. You were in the hand twice. Okay, so ISOing here looks good because that's the right sizing to use. And we have a player who's donking. I think I've said this before, but like, especially when my hand needs less protection, and especially when I don't know what the composition of the donking range is, I'm gonna assume that it's more of a vacuum mass data read, which is that people just will spaz donk because that's just what they do notoriously in that line. So I'm just going call, call, call here, almost closing my eyes. Once he checks, I think this is the right sizing, more or less. I think we should still actually bet and just bet something like half pot, maybe even 2/3. I just really don't think that it might be close. I mean, I kind of like how we have the queen of spade, and it kind of makes me think it's a little bit less thin. Not knowing what the composition of his donking range is, but the fact that he did check call turn, I think he could have a decent amount of jack x and queen x in his range. And versus a fishy type player, I think maybe a bet like 1/3 actually makes a lot of sense here. I think that whether or not we have value on the river really hinges on what his initial donking range was. But I do like the fact that I don't think he improves very often on the king. But it's going to make him overfold also with dominated hands. So I think that's why I'm leaning toward like using a sizing that might play into a fish's mindset of like, oh, I've got such good pot odds. Maybe there's still a crying chance that I can call with a weak queen or a jack 10 type hand. He'll have king jack sometimes here for sure, and sometimes even king queen. But overall, because the donk line is so fishy, and we have that queen of spades blocker, which I rarely talk about, but here I think it actually makes a decent amount of kind of a big deal. I think I would put some sort of small bet size in, maybe like $100 or something. I wonder why he's not. It's funny, I didn't even really have him on mini 3x at all. And I don't think that's wrong. The party seems pretty soft, huh? 3-6 offsuit from calling the ISO. How do I do that? Setting that changes green and red boxes. Witchful, tell me how to do that so I can change it for you guys. In the meantime, I'll take this question by Spewy. How can you tell the difference between being too assumptive and intuitively adapting to the pool's feedback? Good question. I think it has a lot to do with how much trust that the information that you're thinking, how much do you actually trust the consistency of your own thought? Because a lot of guys will state something that's actually part of an old thought process that's not actually backed up in any sort of balanced way. So I think I really didn't develop a ton of trust until I started doing mass database analysis. And I think that would be my final answer, that the way that in poker, there's micro and macro aspects of this, and I'm going to upload a video at the end of this that I recorded last night that might make it more clear. But I'll say a little piece on it now, that like in poker, the micro aspect of becoming less assumptive is to relentlessly challenge anything that's not backed up by empirical data. Now, the macro portion of the learning process is to trust that the direction that you send yourself off in, mass database analysis being one single option, theory being another option, to trust that you can calibrate which one of those which one of those directions offers the most benefit to you. So it depends what level you're looking at it from, but if you're gonna enter an arena where vision over the environment is finite, in terms of like, let's assume we're actually dealing with an objective reality where we could gain vision if we just had the data involved, and that could give us the right answers. Now we have to honor how important data analysis actually is. So that's very much like a scientific approach. Now the other half of like where I would say I operate from as a person in philosophies is that as soon as it comes to the learning process, which is more abstract, more creativity, more mystical in nature, now I completely pull out of the data analysis and I almost disregard it, and I say, sensing into of these three or four options, these four paths that I could go down, which of these seems to offer the most expansiveness, the most opportunity for self-growth and balance, and then I pick that one and I run it until it no longer feels relevant, and then I'm completely okay redirecting from there. Because to me, logic is actually doing the most incentivized thing at any one time. And in the learning process, what I've seen is that if you have four options on the table of directions that you could go, you're better off taking the one that spontaneously feels a little bit more resonant. Like, think about it for a few minutes, but if you're thinking about it for days, weeks, months, like a lot of guys in poker are stuck doing with the theory oriented approach, speculating, when am I going to find the strategy that's sustainable? What actually happens is that remaining in your decisions actually turns into indecisiveness. And now you have a huge problem, because now you're entering a feudal paradigm where you are convincing yourself you're operating from safe logic, where what you're really doing is stumbling over the distortional nature of your own mental pattern, which consistently makes it seem like it's better for you to stay in the planning phase than actually implementing something. So it was like I was at the gym this morning and I wrote that sentence down because I liked it. It's kind of a play on words that if you remain in decisions, you become indecisive. So I think people are actually engaging in the reasoning process for way too long, not realizing that you'll never solve a problem from the level of consciousness that you engage it from, like that Einstein quote. You're better off picking one, running it until it no longer feels inspirational or balanced, and then shifting. And the only way you know that is by getting in the mix of it. Like, you can't train someone how to know what feels accelerated and expansive to them, yet all of you actually already know it. Like, I wish that people would understand more how much you're already a natural at the learning process. I was at the gym 3 days ago. I almost stopped to make a video because for the first time I'm back hitting the weights in a way where I know that I'm pushing through thresholds every single time I'm going there to to PR, personal record. So like everything I put up, I'm like, every time I step to a new machine, I'm like, okay, I'm going as hard as I possibly can this time, and I know I'm improving in this spot. And there's a feeling in that last rep where you squeeze it out, where you know intuitively, like, yep, I just gained. That's what it feels like to me in the learning process when I stumble on a path that I know is building on itself. So I think I can offer that. And there's a video that I'll release at the end of the stream that I think should kind of wrap it up, especially for guys who are trying to leverage more creativity in their process. Oh, server, I'm PRing every day, son. Get off me. I'm not here for fucking entertainment, getting results. Actually, you can troubleshoot this, but so this trainer that I hired told me that as a 29-year-old male coming back into this, and I'm hard cutting at like 1,800 calories a day, he told me I could reasonably work out 7 days a week and not overtrain for at least 2 months. What do you think? Keep in mind, I've been doing this for I'm going on my fourth week, and I've pretty much PR'd every time I've been to the gym, and I've been going 6 to 7 days, and I'm on 1,800 calories a day, which is a pretty hard cut for me. Sorry, I need to look at this again. Okay, so the ISO is good. Four-way to the flop. Party poker looks like a fucking dream so far. Oh, this is the hand we just looked at. I don't think this bet's all that functional. I think we could simplify it just by saying you're not polarized enough to be using this as a bet in this spot in any sort of real frequency. And exploitatively, I don't really see how it makes much sense unless you're planning on triple barreling him, which could actually be like super sick. But it's just a little bit too abstract for me to feel like we should go into. I mean, it could be reasonable now for you to just jam with how big of a range advantage I think you're at. But it's just weird that we have a hand that I would never have in my range in this spot. So it looks like that was your decision, and I don't really have a big problem with it. I wanted to see if bottom left lax box. Okay, cool. For some reason it's still there though. Maybe I have to load again. Strange. I thought I did reopen it though. That is weird. Alright, let's keep going. I think this is a cool exploitative sizing. And then we just need to fold to a raise. Oh yeah, I can just take it off the bottom part of the screen for you guys. Cool. Good call, Brian. See, that's how you solve a problem from one paradigm up right there. I think guys make too big of a deal out of whether or not you're going to 5-bet.
Huh.
Oh, I think we're back. I thought my mic just basically quit on me for good. Alright. So I think people make a little bit too big of a deal on whether or not you should be 5-betting or calling 4-bets. basically the more comfortable you are in playing in position over different runouts, the less of a deal it is anymore whether or not you 5 bet or 4 bet, 5 bet or call 4 bet with these types of hands. Um, because I would guess in theory that they're all very close to being mixed strategies if they're not already. Just extrapolating on what I already know from how many mixed strategies there are pre-flop everywhere else. So unless you have a really good exploitative reason for why you should 5 bet now, like if you know the guy will always 4 bet call off with pocket tens, or if he's the type of guy who will 4 bet call off with ace queen, maybe it makes more sense to be just 5 betting right away with a hand like this. But for the most part, as you gain more confidence in being able to respond accurately, especially with position, which gives you more accuracy, I think that like you become more comfortable just sort of not caring very much whether or not you 5 bet or call 4 bet with hands like this. Now I think in a lot of spots, like if an environment had very very low 4 bet tendencies with a hand like pocket aces, even with the removal properties, I think I would always just 5 bet it because I'm trying to get it in pre-flop versus a range that, or even kings too. I want to get it in versus ace king pocket tens plus all day when I have that much equity pre-flop. Question in the chat. I know this is a pretty general question, so if it's too trivial to waste time on, I completely understand. But when playing heads up, I often get a bit confused when trying to at least play minimum defense frequencies versus opponents who use smaller sizing, but with ranges much tighter than our standard. Yeah, so he's basically talking about the difference between playing a tighter range but getting pot odds. It's also similar to like if the UTG opens and the button calls, does that make 7-6 offsuit more of a call in the big blind or less of a call? I don't exactly know how to solve it. I think there's definitely a counteracting effect that obviously when you're dealing with another range, it's harder to say that your hand has enough realization, I guess if you want to use like the R terminology. That being said, you are getting better pot odds. So I don't think that until we solve preflop, we'll have an idea of how much it counteracts. Like I like the example I use that like, would you rather have the button call if you have 7-6 offsuit? Do you think that raises your EV with the hand if the UTG open and the button calls, or would you rather go heads up? I guess you wouldn't call heads up or 7-6 versus the UTG in the first place if there was no caller, but you get my drift. So the general question is, would I rather have better pot odds, or would I rather have, like, do you value more having another person in the pot, or do you value more playing a single range in terms of squeaking more EV out of your hand? And I think it's not something that can be proven. I splash a lot multi-way, but I think one thing that you could say for sure is that, and I'm sort of just using like conceptual reasoning here, that like if the UTG opens and the small blind player calls, you can make more hands profitable in the big blind for sure, because now you have relative position on one other player in the pot, and that's worth a substantial amount, I think. Like the difference between going to the flop out of position versus two players as opposed to in position on one player and out of position versus the UTG is like a lot. Thanks, lap lay stance. Glad that's hitting home for you guys. Okay, so we need to finish the hand, I guess. Looks like we decided to call, which I think is fine. Calling the flop. I don't necessarily think we can like jam for value here, because I think a lot of guys would check kings and aces in this spot, afraid that you have jacks and tens, and I don't really think that we get a ton in terms of protection for betting. Maybe the right bet sizing here is like $65 just to charge his ace king, but then at that point, like, are we calling a raise? We subject ourselves potentially to him shoving a hand like ace jack just because he doesn't know what else to do with it. So I think it's a tricky spot. I think I would probably just check back the turn and pray for free showdown. If he checks river, I think we actually still have to jam, but let's see. At this point, I think it's a really clear fold. And the reasoning is just that I don't think enough players are going to have a wide enough bluffing range pre-flop, be reopening river into a board that is protected by sets which are very predominant in your 4-bet call range. And lastly, I just don't think ace king gets played often enough this way. So I think this is a fold, and I think it's not close. And I actually think that the relative value of the hand is what's confusing you. It's something I'll be talking about in the new run at once video, because we did like a more advanced. I took one of my more advanced students and did a part two of the 30-second exercise, and even he at 510 zoom on PokerStars still made like a really bad call off, mistaking the relative value of his hand. And what I mean there is that he basically sees the hand as more valuable than it actually is in the situation, because he's not viewing it from the perspective of how does my hand actually fare versus the range that he's betting. He's viewing it more in like an absolute sense of like, oh, I have a flush, or I have one of my highest slow played overpairs from pre-flop. This needs to be a defense. So I'm really glad you found a fold here. Nice. Now this is a spot that's not a hot spot to be barreling river, so I think I would just be checking all day. And I think this goes back to the lesson we had last time with Alex, where if you see some forcing aggression aspects in spots that aren't hot spots, my advice to you until you rebuild your confidence and your win rate is to completely remove that gray area out of your game. Because again, why would we argue for something as a exploitative opportunity that hasn't been backed up with a high enough confidence of empirical data? It would only be because we have some sort of mental bias going on that perceives more benefit in lunging at the pot than just taking the zero EV lineup, checking back. So if you can sort of checkmate yourself like that and see, yeah, there actually is no logical reason why I'd pull the trigger here except for my own assumption. So to go back to what Spewy Griffin was asking, how do you know the difference between assumption and well-balanced thought process? It's basically be honest with yourself about whether or not you've integrated pattern recognition through empirical data to show that this is actually a spot that people are overfolding in general. And keep in mind, we don't have like super high textural abilities in 3-bet pots that run to the river. What we have is an overall frequency that says that once they check, call, flop, and turn, they really don't overfold the river that much. And since that's the extent of what our analysis is capable of at this point, we should probably apply that to all textures rather than try to go in and assumptively be like, yeah, but I think he's going to overfold this one. I'm sure you can do manual grid work to try to make arguments that some textures could still be hotspots for river barrel in this line. But for the most part, in a vacuum, I'm just checking and realize that the skeptical theory argument of that is like, so what, Nick? You just never have a river bluffing frequency anymore? And I would say I won't until I think I've shown a player enough information that he's going to start to try to counter me for that. And then I trust myself to be aware enough that there's been that type of information exchange, that then I can either recounter him or get more balanced against him. But I won't do it until it's incentivized. And that's my whole philosophy. Like, you guys probably think that this shit is way harder than it is, because it actually is advanced, but it's all building from a simplified philosophy that we only should be doing the thing that's most incentivized at any one time. The assumptive part of like the community or just the logic based paradigm of the Western world is that you can't just do the thing that's most incentivized without looking 3 steps ahead, because you could be vulnerable. But that gets you into that overly paranoid reasoning process where you end up only weighing your options, never acting on them, and never learning how to calibrate and adjust. So if I could get one thing across this stream, it would be this point. You're not as vulnerable as you think in the experimental phase. As long as you trust that you have the ability to recalibrate, like, what could really go wrong, guys? And if you're so worried about your bankroll, just drop stakes while you test it out and learn for yourself how capable you are of experiencing the environment doing something, running it through like the tools that you will have as soon as night vision comes out, where you'll be able to replicate mass data analysis, and making balanced decisions of how you want to sort of reroute your direction from there. So many people are stuck in this paralysis of believing that I'm not capable of starting now because there could be vulnerability around the corner, and it's the biggest paralyzer. So here, my simplified approach for scaling a new student, or for scaling a student who's expressed that he feels as though he's lacking confidence, would be to just check back here all day. Let's see what's up in the chat. Serve is the pre-flop expert, so let's yield to him on the on that question that was asked before. He's saying that you'd be surprised how much we still fold even versus tight sizings, or tight range small sizings. Spewy said, pattern recognition and quote unquote assumptions just feel like the same thing to me. Try to move to a perspective where you can see that pattern recognitions are actually the lump data that you've sort of organized in a way that it's now part of a larger context. In other words, and this will be something that we do toward the end of the night vision pack, the data analysis that you get, which is every single line, every single part of the game tree and every single formation, all of the hotspots that we collect from there end up being sort of patterned in terms of the textures that are hot, the lines that are hot, and then contextualized into a strategy of how to implement them accurately. So patterning is not something that I'm intuiting. Patterning is something that I'm gaining from the scientific end of the analysis and then grouping and then integrating so that I can have a context that's actually practical to implement. Without contextualizing something that's that deep, you have no way of actually like pulling it up on the spot. So in some way, at least what's felt very incentivized and practical from a learning perspective, and I'm sure other fields do this too, where like you have all this shit in front of you. Now let's group the things that are kind of connected so that we can sort of study them in, we can sort of small chunk everything. And once you have things chunked, it becomes easier to sort of look and know as opposed to look and analyze. And so like one is spontaneous when it's integrated, one is still relying on the linear path of like step one, step two, step three. Okay, I think this is a good spot. It's like, no, the qualities are here, the pattern is there, I already have it integrated that that's the hot spot, and then I deploy against it. Question in the chat. It sounds like you're strongly suggesting to us that we look for huge imbalance spots and just go with the exploit rather than the current idea of protecting ourselves versus an opponent who's capable of exploiting us. What is an MUBS? But yes, that's what I'm saying. The more incentivized thing is to be on the offense, because as soon as you're on the defense, you end up susceptible not only to your own imbalance, because you can't deploy theory in any sort of balanced way unless you've put in hundreds of hours of grid work to begin with. So most of you are assumptive in how good you are at even implementing well-balanced strategies, unless you're already simplifying your strategic options a ton. And then moreover, more relevantly, it's just not incentivized for you to be in a defensive shell when you could be the one out hunting. Hunters are better. Are you a hunter or a gatherer? Actually, I guess gatherers are chill too. You need them. Oh, I see what you're saying, Spewy. So he said, do you mean patterns in the data? I thought you meant patterns in the pool. Well, it's the same thing. And again, here, it's like that guy who asked, I forget who asked this, but it was a good question where I went one paradigm up where he said, how do you develop aspects of your game that are more accurate while still keeping an eye on what the environment's doing? And I said, well, the assumption is that they're separate. They're not actually separate, just like the pattern in the data is not separate from the pattern in the pool. The profiles of the pool converge into the overall average of the data that you get. So when you're looking at the data, what you're really looking at is the pattern of the pool. So if you can see it like that, then you can see that the data that you're getting is actually directly in line with pattern recognition as it parlays itself back into your environment. And then there's like that merger, there's that synergy where you're like, oh, okay, so the science is the art. Did I just steal? Yep, I just stole Hold Manager's logo, the art and science of poker. But that's really what this is. It's like the patterning is the art of it, and the science of it is the fact that you're actually collecting all the data from the pool to begin with. So the art of it is contextualizing in a way that you can actually implement it consistently and accurately. And then the science of it is learning how to replicate the mass database analysis for any environment that you're in, so that you can set up these charts that lead to the pattern recognition. Yeah, I was thinking about AoE too. Hunters. So yeah, it's exactly Spewy Griffin. It's feel through numbers, and then from there, like, shout out to Kevin, he'll know what I mean by this, but this is a Josh Waitzkin thing. It's feel through numbers, and then it's numbers to leave numbers. So you use as many numbers as you can to pattern recognize it to the point where you integrate it, and you know through the art of it, through the art of pattern recognition, you know which spots you should deploy against, and now you don't need the numbers anymore. Because as soon as you guys actually can see that the numbers are what are weighing you down, the conscious analysis, the linear based analysis is what's so overwhelming and creates that feeling of like, internal resistance, and I'm trying to manage so much at once and I feel like I'm making mistakes everywhere. That's because you haven't left the numbers yet. Once you can actually lump the pattern recognition together in a way that feels relatively balanced and okay, so that you know that this is what I'm capable of from a practical perspective, and this has to be good enough for now. Then you can actually leave the numbers altogether, and now you're operating on feel. And the effect of that, the very valuable side effect of that, is that when you leave the numbers, you have a massive amount of mental energy that frees up to put your attention on stuff like data points. So now you're basically parlaying energy that used to be spent on really futile linear based analysis in a hand, and you're opening your awareness up, so now you have way more relevant data points that are able to come in and sort of balance your decision points, because now you see stuff like, oh, this guy was actually on the small blind pre-flop, which means he's playing a more linear 3-bet range on a run out that's got 2 Broadway cards on it. I can use that to lean toward a fold. Stuff that you can't see if your mind is off in fairy tale land trying to basically linearize some sort of theory oriented analytics. I actually was looking for Age of Empires the other day online, and it seemed like nobody still plays it on battle.net. It got like, I guess you can play like AoE 3. Maybe it's for the best that it wasn't still out, because that game got banned from my home when we were 12 years old, because it literally took over my household. Like, me and my 3 brothers would like fight for the computer so we could try to get back in a match, trying to get those records up. So this is, I think, just a fold pre, and I don't think it's close. Although we're getting, yeah, I mean, he's using a slightly smaller sizing, but I still think like this probably is classified as a spot where server was talking about, where I think it's definitely still a fold. Unless you could argue that his 3-bet range was substantially wider than what I think is universal for the pools. I just feel like you're crushed with this hand versus small blind linear 3-bet. Server, your thoughts on this would be appreciated. Suited, it's a call, yeah, especially for those pot odds. Any reads on this player, Juan? Here, what I see, it's like this. Funny. It's the same thing I just said. Where if you open your awareness up, you'll see that this is a small blind player who's using a linear pre-flop range on a triple Broadway run out. Very, very, very hard for him to be able to find enough bluffs in his range unless he's very cute about how he organizes his turn barreling range and then his river bluffing range. So I think this is like a very clear fold. Nice job. Suited Aces asked, Nick, I've been struggling with staying aggressive after a huge upswing like I've had this month. I tend to always assume I'm just running good and always on the lookout for the next downswing. Not a good place to be in. I know that. I know that place though. How can I combat that with a negative? How can I combat that negative mindset while also trying to be analyzing my game? I think it's by coming to terms with the fact that you might actually be running well, and that's okay, and that it doesn't mean that your strategy is not still profitable. Like, if you're crushing on an upswing, you're probably running well. But that doesn't mean that you should expect to lose all your profits back because, you know, your strategy isn't already good. You're playing a blueprint strategy that is already winning at a good clip. You just happen to be above average on that clip. I think the negative mindset comes from a deep rooted belief that you might not be worthy of this success. In my experience, that was what it was. Like, as soon as I had that upswing, I'd be like, holy shit, this could actually be for real, that I'm about to be a big winner. And then all of the old beliefs would creep back in, like, no, you haven't studied enough yet to earn that, or you're not confident of a person enough yet to be able to sustain this. All of that is, you won't be able to sustain the mental frame that continues to win unless you come to terms with the fact that the doubts in your mind are actually very, very assumptive. They're just old patterns that were conditioned from results that had you believing that the results were directly reflective of your self-worth. And this is what I think is so useful about guys understanding how breaking mental patterns, which is the same thing as breaking a paradigm, works, is that if you've put in a large sample, like say from 18 to 24, you played poker as a marginal rakeback winner or something, and you never had a lot of confidence, realize how the grind of that, like the resistance of reality always feeling like it's bogging down on you and never allowing you to really take off, that has conditioned you to believe that you're worthy of only being a rakeback grinder. Um, the mind has a funny way of rationalizing its self-worth through what it has experienced in the past over and over again. Yet the reason you've experienced that reality is because of the self-worth that you believed in. So to switch your paradigm is to basically demand more from reality in terms of the abundance to scarcity gradient. Um, and it's not just some lofty law of attraction thing. The person that you show up as, including how you basically go after opportunity, from everything from that to how you detect data points in a hand because you have more mental awareness, all of that starts to stack on itself relevantly so that you can move to higher levels of accuracy, which breed higher levels of results. Like, it's not as like mystical as people think. Like, yes, a lot of it is sort of experiential and not as scientific when you get to like the intuitive aspects of learning, but the results of it are very clear. I'm more accurate as I engage with my environment, and then that's what the results are coming from. It's not that like I'm using the force to like draw shit toward me. I mean, I think that you kind of are too, but that's for another day. See, there's no reason to keep it anything. I'm going to go into this real quick, just a real quick rant, because a lot of you guys, you might think of me as someone who's more spiritual in nature, but I came back home for Christmas. I was spending a lot of time with my brother, who's a physicist, and he's very scientific. And what we did the other night was we watched a few YouTube videos on some of the top spiritual gurus that decided it was a good idea to face off some of the best scientists in an arena where they were using a scientific framework to structure the debate, which is really fucking silly for the spirituality guys, because if they try to win the game on the level of science, they're going to lose all day because it's already rigged against them. In other words, science is already sort of based in a paradigm that needs objective proof in order to justify that certain experiential directions or philosophies are worth having. But I say, if spirituality really wants to make the leap that I think it could make in the next 10 to 20 years, and I'm not talking about religion, I'm just talking about deep self inquiry as it is relevant to enhancing the person's experience. That's all spirituality should really be, in my opinion. It shouldn't be, let's prove that there's God or that consciousness is infinite. Why? Because that's not actually what's most relevant. If a spiritual argument was to be formulated logically, it would just say, science, I don't really give a fuck what you say because I know if I do this with this perspective in my direct experience and this changes for the better and then my results come, that's simply what's most relevant to me. At the point at which it stays based on direct incentive, that's the logical argument for spirituality. And they shouldn't stray from that. As soon as they go science on it, it just becomes completely like woo-woo, lofty, And it's pseudoscience because the scientists will always rip you apart in the scientific game. So just my little rant on why I think spirituality is widely misunderstood. It's because the big leaders of spirituality are doing it in injustice. They're doing the topic an injustice by trying to prove it to scientists through a pseudoscience language. They just get ripped apart every time. It should just be about, I want to do this thing in my own direct experience with my perspectives because it generates more happiness in me. And then when I deploy from that frame or state of being, I actually get more results over a large sample. That's all it should be, and everybody should shut the fuck up about everything else because it's not helping to engage in debate from two completely different paradigms. If you want to win, you have to be sort of secure enough in your spot to say, this is correct for me, and I've verified that through my own direct experience, and nothing can challenge that unless you can offer me a more optimized experience. Isn't that what we're like? If I asked you, what is the most logical thing to you? Wouldn't we eventually get to the answer, I want to be happy? Otherwise, why would you do anything if you didn't think it was scaling towards more happiness? So if we can base it strictly on that, I think we can get a more direct sense of what logic actually is. And to bring it back to poker, that's all I'm even doing. I'm just doing the thing that seems most incentivized at any given time, and then watching how that blossoms into something that's actually scaling from a macro perspective and appears highly intelligent down the road, but all I did the entire time was just scale to the next incentivized point. I didn't plan on any of this. I didn't plan on having this stream 8 months ago. I didn't plan on having a coaching business. I just decided to go all in on incentive. So that's what that video is about that I'm going to release at the end of the stream. Okay, I'm going to spend our last 25 minutes a little bit more on Juan because I feel like we haven't gotten him much win rate yet. I think you've made 3 really good folds, by the way. That it's the type of stuff that we would have seen in the previous streams as the major leaks. I think this hand's fine. And this is a fold. Basically, code red run out. Your range is protected. Linear small blind 3-bet. You're just not going to have enough bluffs on average from a vacuum type opponent. And I really think even versus the most aggressive guys at the limit, this is probably just a fold. You can't really call for a split at this point. So you know what I mean? I guess what I mean is if it didn't one card straight off, I think I still would have folded the river. If you just had the baby straight. I think calling's better than jamming here. And I love that you checked back because it shows that you understand that your hand has a very substantial amount of non-zero EV. I think checking back here in practice is going to be higher EV than betting. I'm not sure how it models in theory, but I think that the way that this plays is far from how it models. So I'm not really concerned with what's going on in theory. Mixing it up with the check. I guess you just have to raise. Shit. It would really suck to raise and then get jammed on, and then have to wonder, is he capable of raising a queen, re-raising a queen, or do I have to fold and really consider that one of them has set of nines, quad nines? I can't see that this is right unless this player is going to make big mistakes behind. I feel like you're better off just because this guy's got a 9 a lot, I think. Blocker betting with a 9. Or you're just splitting with a queen. I very rarely think this is a bluff unless he's a total spew-tard. Any reads, Juan, on this player right here? I think the reason that I would call would be if I thought this player could make poor calls behind or potentially blow up with a bluff raise behind. So I don't really fault your. Also, if you think this player will always fold a 9 if you raise, which is reasonable considering you really can't Like, how often would you actually play a bluffing raise here when there's another player behind you, and there's like tons of boats on board? It's probably a spot where this player could find a really easy exploitative fold. Therefore, you're almost subjecting yourself to like quad nines for no reason if you do decide to play a raise. He's a solid reg. Okay, so I think calling's cool. I'm saying calling I think is really good because I would expect a solid reg to be able to find a fold there all day with a 9 based on the fact that you would be raising with a player behind you. And I think actually like it's kind of silly to say this, but like I feel like quad nines is a larger portion of their distributions than it would be on like in other spots where we'd be like worried about quads. I feel like I'm actually kind of a little bit more worried about quads here than usual because it could be a hand that's in both of their ranges very easily. Um, Even though it's still like a really low percentage of their range. This just, I mean, I almost pattern recognize this as a fold, but let's go back through it one more time. Okay, so it's ISO. I thought initially that he opened and went bet check bet. I think this is different in the sense that because he's a fish, now he's a different type of profile who could be turning ace 4 into a bluff, who could be betting with a hand like ace 3. I can't see how we can justify folding in this line. So you see how it changed where initially I thought it was a bet check bet line from a PFR, and I'm pattern recognizing that immediately as a spot where I know they're not bluffing enough. Now when we change the line and the profile, which is that it's a fish who limp called, check called the flop. Oh, we're 3-betting? Huh. Any reads on this guy? Because now the difference now is that his range is tighter. He's not a limp caller, so I can't put him in the fish profile anymore. He's now got a call versus 3-bet range, which is Broadway heavy and also, like pushing a decent amount of equity on the flop. In theory, this is definitely a call. Um, I think it's definitely a spot we don't want to overfold because of all the broadways that missed, and because you use that small flop c-bet sizing, it's a data point that I'm recognizing it's going to cause him to peel more broadways. So like on the runouts, like this is a very favorable runout to bluff catch on versus someone who peeled a lot of broadways. So depending on, I think I would rather be up against, like I don't think I'd mind being up against reg in this spot because I think the reg's going to defend the flop fairly well. And then be bluffing pretty aggressively with most of his broadways on the river. I think even a hand like ace jack gets bluffed here pretty aggressively by a reg. I think I would click call too. Did you? Oh, you just called. You didn't raise. Okay, cool. At first I thought you put a raise in. So yeah, I think that hand's played okay. And this is a spot I would give up, very similar to the the king queen hand where you had the flush draw and then gave up on the river. Cool. And reason just being that I don't see enough hotspots occur in those lines, and I'm not well studied enough on specific runouts to be able to say that I should override that. Just a clear check call here. Looks good. And for the reason it's so clear is because the data point that pulls to the front is that we could be dominating hands in his value range, which immediately makes it a call. Like a substantial amount of hands in his value range because he can have ace 6, ace deuce, queen 7. Back on the last hand, the guys are asking if ace high needs to bluff. I do believe that because your merge bet includes hands like ace queen and ace king, that a hand like ace jack would have incentive to bluff. We would have to model it. But I think in practice, I've for sure seen people reopen with ace jack. You'll also see the more passive guys just check it though. So I think both happen, and then you have to create sort of a confidence interval and settle on just the fact that it's happening sometimes and not others. Call 3-bet. Call flop is standard. Check back here I think is more standard. Um, I think solver would definitely favor checking more than betting. Reasons for betting would be if you think he's just going to ditch ace king right now and not call with enough ace queen. Um, or if you plan on a multi-street line where you go bet and you think that that's going to create a disproportionate amount of fold equity on the river because he peels too much with a hand like ace king on the turn. Like if you thought that his range was not well protected enough with overpair, I could see how turning this hand into a two-street bluff makes a lot of sense. Because now by the time he check calls turn and gets to river, his range looks like a lot of ace king, ace queen, ace deuce, ace three, ace four, some 9x, maybe a few amount of overpairs. So that would be the the type of read that I would have to have in order to go in for two streets would be that this guy's not protected enough with overpairs in the check call line, and I actually think that's a decent read. Um, I like these spots where he's unprotected with the nutted portion of the range, we'll say overpair plus, and we can also expect him to drag a decent amount with like some wheel draws. Like if he had ace deuce, ace three, ace four, all hands that are probably in his three betting range, ace king for sure, which beats us, ace queen, which we would also love to fold out. That seems like a good spot to like Marshall 28 it, like I said last time, and like only bet turn with intentions of betting river 2 on most runouts, obviously. The Peter Jennings line I'm turning into like a verb form now. Cool. So I like that for the reasons that I stated. I think your aggression so far is like looking pretty calibrated. That looks fine. I think I would just 4-bet this, but it's fine to call it. The reason I'd 4-bet it is I just feel like the hand just has enough equity to get in pre-flop that I don't want to slow play and end up out of position versus two players because I think I lose accuracy over the course of the hand. And being able to kind of get money in when I want to without giving the image that I don't want to give, which is that I'm nutted. Like I think maybe this is a weird thing to say, but I feel like anytime you try to fast play post flop, you're almost repping a hand that's stronger than you want to. So I feel like it almost becomes almost a weird value own, in the sense that I think people can make some big folds versus you. Like on a board like this, if like this guy bet and you get and then you rip with this guy behind you, I think this guy could fold a hand like queens, and that kind of sucks. That's a good card. I don't favor keeping the fish in as much when I'm out of position versus two players post flop and I have kings. Like I've been watching my Doug Polk videos, so I know that with kings we should rarely be slow playing pre-flop. If we have aces, that's okay. But like there's merit in that simplification. There's a big difference between kings and aces in terms of, an ace flopping 17% of the time or something, and then being up against two guys who have high distributions of ace x. So considering that the fish will often like just stick it in with tens plus pre-flop anyway, even if you just cold 4-bet, I think I'd value just getting it in pre, neutralizing the positional disadvantage. I like the call here. Now you're playing way above your range. So that seems fine. Here's a spot where I don't think I would float, unless I had a read that the player had aggro check raise or check raised very merged. The reason I would want one of those reads is that I need his range to be wider before I can justify calling, obviously. And this hand would be like in an optimal defense, I think. But the reason that I don't mind if he's merged, like even if this guy's imbalanced because he doesn't have too many bluffs, if he's merged, he stands the risk of playing passively on the turn in a spot where he's at a vision disadvantage to the point where, like, because he doesn't know how many overcards we float with intentions of just trying to barrel him off once he shuts down, he ends up probably folding way too much money away if he's the type of guy that functions under the assumption that he can check raise with pocket pairs here, because once they get floated, they don't get barreled enough on future streets by bluffs. Then we become that nemesis opponent, basically. By nemesis, it's theoretical jargon for the guy who will play a maximally exploitative strategy versus you. At this point, I think we have to just fold. You could be drawing dead. You could be drawing to reverse implieds, and the rest of his range is a set, which I don't think is folding on any non-diamond river. So I'm already moving away from a theory. Like this hand would be a call in theory, I think, almost for sure. But I'm already moving away from that because I think that now his range is substantially tighter and more equity driven than it should be in theory. And I just really don't like the way my hand fares versus the different types of tiers of his range. So I'm marking this one as your first leak. I guess I just don't think that what was the sizing too? I don't think that you're getting a decent price. I don't think that our hand is live enough because we only peel a diamond, like 20% of the time on the river. And the formation being UTG-MP, I think makes his range substantially stronger here too. But I don't think that we're alive enough to counteract that sometimes we're going to have reverse implieds on the diamonds, or we're just going to be we're already drawing dead. So I'm not really happy with the second nut draw, with the second high flush draw on a board where I already think he's very, very set heavy or equity driven heavy with nut flush draws. I think I would just find the fold because I don't think when the diamond comes, I don't think the diamond comes often enough to give you reason enough to call versus his sets, and the deuce of diamonds is not even live in that case. Now if we have a total fish, like here's the thing too, and it goes back to the merge statement at the beginning. If you know that he's merged and that he could potentially bet turn here merge too, you can justify floating as long as you feel like he's going to check the river. Because I'm assuming this guy check folds the river if he bets the turn and then checks. But realize that like this is a profile that's very, very rare. Maybe not on party. Like maybe this is the best site ever. But I think this is a rare enough profile that we can't just go around assuming that he has merged hands, like a very high amount of merged hands left in his range that are going to be check folding river very liberally. So I guess this is a good spot to sort of say the hardest thing to do before you have mass database analysis, and sometimes the hardest thing to be honest with even after you have it, is that you can't allow yourself to start to doubt or become results oriented when you see certain deviations, because in any system there are anomalies. The best that you can do is try to player profile someone so that you can say with high confidence or higher confidence that he's a player that could potentially be doing this. And that's what I sort of tried to do on the flop when I said if he's more merged, I think we could float more. But then at the point where like he's barreling turn now, I think that profile becomes even more rare. The type of guy that would continue to merge bet after he's been given resistance to on the flop on the flush closing card. The other problem is like there's a profile of this type of guy who'll just like blast river, like completely unaware that he's playing an 8. He'll just turn it into a bluff, and that sucks because then he's still bluffing you off the hand. So it's a consideration, and I just think that things can get unclear enough that there's really not much you can do in terms of being like perfectly accurate, and that's something you have to accept because the best that you can do is devise confidence intervals that sort of can allow you to sleep at night because they're rooted in the empirical data. I wonder if it has to be a river value bet too though. Like no one's checking enough nut flush on the river. Not even close. So yeah, maybe you don't bet full pop, but I think there's and also no one is check ripping enough with bluffs here. So I'm not worried about betting 70 and then like having a decision when I get raised. I'm just snap folding versus a raise. Um, so why not just bet like something like 80 and put him in a really hard spot with a set? In other words, if you had, say you could have a bluff here. I don't know how you could have one because the diamond completes all your turn floats pretty much. But if you could have a bluff based on the range that you would expect him to have here, would you be confident bluffing for $80? This is sort of a way that you can check for a contradiction in your thought process. If you're not confident in bluffing for $80 and you also want to make the assumption that he doesn't have much nut flush in his range, then that kind of automatically makes king queen with a king of diamonds a value bet. This is probably the bottom of the defense range. I think versus some tight small blinds you could even find a fold pre-flop with these types of hands. Kind of crazy to say, but I think this is fine, and it's just a fold on the river. Check raise looks good. I think I'd go a little bigger though. I get that this player is a fish, so maybe that's why you're thinking. I mean, you're giving 4-1. I think it's okay. I think maybe I'd go like, I think I'd maybe give like 3.5-1, 3-1. I don't really see a need to check here and just give free realization on a card that kind of is more connected. I think like a lot of his pair plus draw are just going to stick it in. And then like the heart draw, which might check back, is just something that you're giving free realization to. I just don't expect the fish to be making like sick folds on the turn. Because again, would we be comfortable bluffing in this spot? Because I feel like we'd probably be paranoid that the fish is just going to stick it in with any pair plus. So again, it's the same concept of checking for a mental contradiction to try to distinguish what the highest EV line is. In this case, to get the money in as fast as possible. And at the point where he checks, now we just definitely have to rip. I wish we could see his hand. So like if he's folding a flush draw there, like not to be massively results oriented, but realize that if he was going to call most of the hands that he would call off in the line that you played, if he was going to call most of them on the turn anyway, then all you've really done is given him the chance to check back a hard draw and then suck out on you for free. And I know I'm massively oversimplifying it, but when I'm dealing with a fish profile on a super connected board for like a half pot jam, I just feel like on average he's going to be sticking it in often enough to incentivize us to get the value right now and then get the bonus of charging the draw. What's the line? I think this, I'm going to skip this one because I feel like it's one of those, yeah, we're at the same table with ourselves again. Yeah, thanks, man. Flop looks good. Turn, I think we have to just fold, and it sucks. I don't think we have great implieds on the jack. I think we'll be splitting at best when we hit the jack. So it's not an implied card, it's a direct odds card. The more you think you can get it in clean when you hit a club and get called by two pair plus, the more I think you have reason to call here. Let's just put it that way. At the point at which someone's going to start making big folds when you open jam a club, I think you just need to start check folding. So here it's like a player profile thing of how much respect do you give your opponent to be able to fold a hand like ace 10 or ace queen or a set of fours if a club hits the river. If you don't think he's capable of folding those hands, you have more implieds on your draw. This line server was, I'll play it again for you. It's definitely not a check raise, let's put it that way, because he's so value heavy in this spot. Like it's very hard for him to have anywhere near enough bluffs in this line on this texture. So check ripping is the worst option because you just don't have any real fold equity versus a range that's polarized to hands that aren't bet folding. Like I would almost doubt that like ace 10 is like the stone bottom of his value range here, and a lot of guys might even check back ace 10 since the queen kind of substantially improves your range. So my point is that like ace queen plus is never bet folding in this spot, and I think he's got those hands at such a high frequency that it doesn't make sense for you to check rip. The only argument that you'd have for check ripping is that he sometimes bet folds ace 10, but there's no logical argument to be made for the fact that he could be still bluffing enough here to incentivize you to be check ripping. Kaiser, sure, the form crawl episodes are going to be uploaded to YouTube. Brian's been working on it. It takes a while to upload them, but I think they should be up shortly. Sand looks okay. Why would you check raise their server? Is that what you mean? I don't think it's a bad call as long as you think people will pay you on a club. That being said, not all of your clubs are even live, which sucks. And you're not peeling to the nut flush. I think that's less relevant because I think very few guys would show up with a nut flush that's dominating you there on the turn to play that line. But the big thing is, can you get paid on a club when you open rip? Um, and I do think that you have to open rip because I think a lot of guys will shut down with two pair plus when the club does hit, so you don't get paid often enough when you check. And you certainly don't catch enough bluffs because they weren't bluffing enough to begin with. Oh, you're such a nit server. I would open like any two suited in this spot and feel okay about it. But that's just because I'm used to environments where it's two things. I'm used to environments where people aren't defending enough or three betting enough pre, and I trust myself a lot post flop. This is a simple thing, but I had this shift somewhere over the course of the year that it made a lot more sense to me than it ever did. That like the more accurately you start playing post flop, the more you can justify expanding your value range, expanding your ranges pre flop. This is what you hear guys like. I think a lot of guys say, well, I worked with a high stakes guy and he said pre-flop doesn't matter. It's a dangerous thing to tell someone who's operating from a lower context because they'll begin to think that that's just a law. Like a pre-flop doesn't matter because there's not big mistakes that you can make, but that's actually very far from the truth. Pre-flop matters a lot depending on your post-flop ability. And pre-flop becomes more lenient territory when you can make more things happen for yourself post-flop. This is just a fold. I wonder if that was what server meant. I think he was talking about the initial open. But yeah, I'm just not like yes, this is a spot where I think the odds are blinding you. Where you're out of position versus a three better. This guy's overcalling. You have 5-8 club. Yeah, you're getting 3.5 to 1 almost. But I think with the strength of these ranges, it's going to be really hard to turn a profit, and I think you just have to ditch it. That's a nice flop. I would never do anything but check raise here. Nice. I'm not sure that you need to rip. I guess I'm not sure that it offers you... Like, ripping is good if nobody's ever going to fold a king. But if they'll start calling with a king for like 150, if you make it like 140 or something, 150, and folding if you rip, I think it makes a bigger deal. Like, really, your sizing is large enough as soon as it takes significant EV away from whatever drawing hands they have. And I feel like you only need to like go to maybe 150-ish to accomplish that. So my decision for sizing here would basically be if I thought that people could fold king jack, but they would call it for 150 from the more theory oriented premise that like they have to just because you have to understand once a guy peels with king jack, it's very hard for him to fold a future street. Like that's where people fuck up constantly because it's the idea of that they get pot stuck. So I guess I look at it from a little bit more of an exploitative perspective that like if the two sizings are close to go to 140 or to go to 340, I think that I would generally like to use the smaller one because I want to get the guy as pot stuck as possible because I think he compounds errors more often on future streets. Um, then again, if I thought the guy's psychology revolved around believing that a rip here represented a flush draw at a high rate, then he would never fold a king. Now the rip becomes the best way to maximize. But that's a very detailed profile read to have on a player. So that would be verging on assumption, just to kind of keep with the theme that Spewy Griffin sort of brought up before, is like, how do we know when to stop believing our train of thought when it gets less rooted in empirical data? And I guess there's an intuitive aspect of that there too, that like I don't think it's that hard to see that like if you make it 140 instead of ripping, the guy is more pressured with a hand like King Jack to continue, because that's actually a theory concept. Like the less that you raise, the wider his defense has to be in order to make sure that he's playing correctly. And then what I'm saying is, once he does peel often enough with all of his King X versus the smaller raise sizing, I think he compounds future mistakes, which is what by calling too much, which is what I want when I have the 8-5. Yeah, we talked about that before, Witchful, where I sort of yielded to server on that, but like I really feel that when ranges become tighter and tighter, and also stack to pot ratio is being diminished for 3-bet pot, that we have to start to clamp up our call 3-bet range a lot more. Like this, I can't prove, but every bone in my body tells me that this pre-flop call is like substantially losing. I like what server just said too. Um, yeah, you're basically weighing that against the possibility that he's like, oh, this guy's jamming, must have a flush draw, never folding the king, call. Like that's a good outcome, obviously. All right, cool. Brian, post that link for the guys in the chat. Juan, I think that this sample went like well for you. Like every single big fold that I thought you would make, you did. I thought there was one hand where I had a problem with, and I don't even think it was the King 9 club hand. I think that hand was close enough, maybe slightly losing. So I think what's different about this lesson review is that this player actually doesn't have large pot leaks from this sample, as we can tell, and it kind of fits more with his analysis of that. He said he kind of knows what he needs to do, which is small ball aggression. And I'd like to draw back in like that question in the chat that could help with this, which was, how do we, like coming off an upswing, how do I know, like this is interesting. The guy who came off an upswing said that he had trouble continuing to be aggressive because he just keeps thinking he's going to lose. But that guy is actually the same player as the guy who's stuck in a passive low confidence zone and can't get the momentum to force aggression in the first place. See how the paradigm actually perpetuates itself even after you have the financial success? This is what I mean when I say that people who come into quick money will not be able to sustain that money because they don't feel like they deserve it. And then it's not just like a lofty type thing where like, oh, I don't feel like I deserve it, so then my money is going to go away. It's like, no, your decision making process will actually sabotage you. If you don't feel worthy of the position that you've gained through whatever experience has brought to you, you will quickly find a way to invalidate that experience through the form of decisions that line up with putting you back into your old place, your old pattern of scarcity. So it's funny that even the run good that allows a guy to sort of get the money that should validate that the aggression worked still has him paranoid in the overly passive mode, believing that it's gonna come back to haunt him, that it was just variance. So for guys who are struggling to consistently implement the type of small ball aggression strategies that I advocate through all these streams, let me think what my one sentence advice would be to you guys. Besides pick up night vision, which I honestly think is the best technical balance for you. I'm looking for a good mental game balance. I think it would just be to accept that it could work for you, and that there's no difference between you and someone like me or any of my students who are already doing it, except for the fact that they're not preoccupied with trying to sustain it. Like as soon as you actually trust that this could work and that it doesn't have to be like, I know it's not how you probably thought it would end up looking, that this would be how you get to high stakes, because in a way it's simpler. We're just like, identify the hot spots, close your eyes in a lot of spots, and just press bet. Like Juan was talking about missed c-bet spots that he knows he just doesn't stab enough. And I'm like, well, I could do a filter on that, but it would literally be me just being like, bet, bet, bet. So I think a lot of the resistance that guys have is that they just don't think it could be this simple, and they're preoccupied with wondering, they're like, there's got to be something that could go wrong here. There's got to be something that people are going to do to make this clear that it couldn't be this easy or it couldn't be this streamlined. And you just have to silence those thoughts and just keep on plowing. Before you know it, what really switches it is when you have that 100,000 hand sample, where you're running at 5 BBs per 100 or 10 BBs per 100 or something. And now you can see that it's pressing out to the point where there's more conviction being gained that it's not variance. Something happens to the mind when you reach the threshold of volume goal that you deem to be acceptable for proving that it's not variance, where then suddenly you have a confidence shift. And that might be different for everyone. But like you can run variance simulators and see that like if you have a 10 BB win rate, a 100,000 hand sample, and you're running at EV, like on par with your EV line, it's really, really hard for you to be like far off. It's really, really hard for you to be a losing player, like probably less than 5% chance for sure. So once you have sort of samples like that, you can really get a good amount of confidence going in knowing that, okay, this system, this blueprint system that I'm deploying with actually seems to be very, very sound in the sense that there's very little chance that it's actually wrong at this point in the application process. So guys that ask, how do I gain confidence in my strategy? Experimentation, consistency. The mind is a speculator, and it can only be overturned by putting it into action in a way that it gets, like, think about your life up to this point, if you're not where you want to be in poker, has been a bombardment of bad shit happening to you. That's why you went through stages where you probably thought that poker was rigged and all that shit. You're trying to come out of a context that was manipulated by an environment that was giving you things other than your preference the whole way. Realize how that's going to take a certain amount of time for you to become acquainted with what it's like for you to actually start getting the type of shit that you want, and realize that the only way that you're going to be able to facilitate that transformation is if you put yourself into action where the rubber meets the road and just come at it with a blueprint that you trust, with your head down for maybe a few months until you have that graph and you can look up and be like, oh, okay, here's my new reality. Now let's lock it in and scale from there. Cool. Thanks, guys. See you back on, I don't even know. I think we got one more lesson. Oh, I have to make an announcement. No stream Friday. I'm going to one of my best friend from high school's bachelor party in Nashville, and I'm going to get shit-faced. So no stream Friday, back on Monday, and we'll probably be doing another volunteer lesson. I think I have one scheduled, and then crawl on Wednesday. Peace, guys.